make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
But based on that history, you're asking people to trust you to come up with the laws and to be fair and all that when you've never proven that you can do it. And I would say this too, what you call Christianity, a lot of Christians like myself wouldn't even recognize it. So this isn't about the thing about this is it's not about Christianity. It's about conservative ideology. And it's also, a lot of it is kind of some type of identity politics on the right, which just doesn't serve anybody well. And there's nothing within the history of this country to say that they would be fair and if they were able to wield that much power and everybody just had to. It's not Christianity.
Well, hey there, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on YouTube, thanks for being here. Make sure you like, subscribe, do that great stuff that hacks this algorithm. Of course, I'm your faithful host, Josh Bertram, and I'm joined by our political host, Will Wright. It's good to see you, Will.
Yeah, good to see you.
And we are excited today to be able to interview Justin Giboney. He is an attorney, political strategist, and ordained minister based in Atlanta, Georgia. He serves as the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, a coalition of urban Christians committed to bringing gospel-shaped conviction and compassion into the public square. He's a former student athlete at Vanderbilt University, where he earned his bachelor's degree in social policy and philosophy, followed by a law degree from Vanderbilt Law School. Before entering public ministry, he worked in a law firm in Atlanta and served on the board of the Urban League of Greater Atlanta. In his civic engagement, he's helped manage local campaigns and infrastructure referenda and was selected as a delegate for the Democratic National Convention in both 2012 and 2016. He's a published author and frequent co-op editor and contributor, including work in Christianity Today and The Hill. And Justin, we are super excited to have you on the show to talk about your latest book. And don't let nobody turn you around, how the Black church's public witness leads us out of the culture war. Justin, thanks so much for coming on and spending some time today to talk through this.
Thanks for having me on, man. I'm excited about the conversation.
Absolutely. So if you had to tell one story that kind of captures the Black church's public witness, which is something that you cover in depth in this book, especially in the Reconstruction era, what is the story that kind of sits, if there is a story or a set of stories that sits underneath this whole book? And why would that be the story that you would want to convey to our listeners?
Oh, that's a good one. I think this Shirley Chisholm, George Wallace story from the 1972 presidential election. They're both running to be president. Shirley Chisholm running to be the first African-American woman president. And obviously George Wallace being the arch segregationist. He ends up getting shot in an assassination attempt. And he gets a surprising guest in his hospital, which is Shirley Chisholm, who comes by and first expresses how she feels like this shouldn't have happened. She was sorry that this happened to him. And this, let's keep in mind, she's talking to somebody who not only wouldn't want her to vote, but probably had called her and folks like her the N-word multiple times. But she comes and visits him, takes time off the campaign trail to come visit him. And they, she kind of talks and, they discuss what they had differences on. And she tells him, and during this whole time, apparently he can't stop crying. Like it's really shook him. She not only talks about where their differences were, but she talks about what she agreed with him on, which was the fact that there was too much corporate capture of Washington and that small people weren't getting enough attention. I thought that just was amazing because we know, anybody who knows Shirley Chisholm knows that she fought against segregation with tenacity. And at the same time, she could listen to a segregationist and take the time to hear where she actually thought he made some good points. I think that, in a nutshell, tells you about the spirit of the civil rights movement.
Why did you choose now to kind of write nobody, don't let nobody turn you around? And what specifically about the Black church's witness do you think is so lacking in kind of our conversations about, culture wars and how we fight them or how we support them?
Yeah, one of the reasons I thought it was timely is because we are going through some serious issues right now. I think that people are rightly concerned about the Trump administration and things that they have done. At the same time, I wanted to show people that this isn't the first time people have faced these type of obstacles or greater obstacles, and that there's a different way to go about it. I think today we seem to think that if the threat is big enough, then Christian principles don't really, we can somehow find an exception to those principles. And I would say no. I say that's actually when your principles matter the most. And so you have people during the civil rights movement whose churches are being, whose friends are being lynched, and they still treat their opposition with a certain level of dignity and civility while fighting hard, just as hard as anybody else for their rights. That's what we have a hard time capturing, the tenacity and the grace and how they go together, and how us kind of having these public temper tantrums and calling people names and all this is actually not effective. For some reason, we began to think that's effective, and it's not. Another quick reason is because I think there's a lot of revisionist history around the civil rights movement. I think conservatives and progressives have tried to co-opt it, and I wanted to correct the record.
I remember back, I guess it was either 2016 or early 2017. It was right after Trump won the election, and on the Daily Show at the time, Trevor Noah was hosting it. And I remember, I don't think it was the day right after, but it was some period before or after, where he made the comment that, there's a lot of people really worried and freaked out about Trump for good reason. But the Black community has been pretty solid, because they're looking at the news and they're seeing all this racism and all this other stuff that's out there, and they're just like, yeah, of course it exists. Like there was no surprise for those that have experienced racism. And I'm curious if some of that played a part in kind of like the Black church's witness, like their ability to confront some of these issues face on without being so reactionary, as oftentimes you see.
Yeah, I think there was a sort of resilience and sobriety with which they addressed the issues. And I think that's a matter of faith. When we see people, and I will say this, I think for a portion of the Black church today, that's true, but I see some cracks in that perspective as well, if I'm going to be honest. But I do think it's a true belief in God's promises and that God is on your side. And when you really believe that, your public witness looks a lot different than a lot of the hysteria that we see in other places. I think it's a direct reflection of their faith.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I really want to dive into your ideas about the culture war, right? And I just want to state it, make sure I understand what you're saying. And then if you could help our audience understand it in even more clear terms, essentially what I saw you do in the book is you're saying that the culture wars have discipled American Christians, especially white American Christians, more than anything else, more than the gospel, more than scripture, anything else. And essentially the Black church has had to, because of the power asymmetry, has had to almost take a back seat in one sense, and they're left out of it, but of the culture, or absorbed in its own way into it, maybe. And then, but with that, because of their experience, they've been able to classically stay out of like we have an actual answer to stay orthodox, to stay big on truth, not thin on sin. And also, though, to stay big on justice and recognize systemic issues. Is that correct, what I'm saying? Or how would you correct that, and how would you maybe build on that?
No, I think you make a good point. So the culture war in general, James Davison, who coined the term, says that this was a battle between white conservatives and white progressives. That's how the battle started, and those have been the principles of the culture war. Now, that doesn't mean other groups haven't been subject to the outcomes, but other groups, just like the Black church, weren't in a position to fight for domination, right? So the culture war is who's going to control the definition of what American is, American values.
Yes.
What's going to be the force there? We were fighting for rights. We weren't fighting for control of those things. And so I think that's one big difference. But one history point in the book that I think is really important and should interest some people is that while this culture war is going on, all the way from the 1920s up until now, in the beginning, in those first few decades, you see within their publications the Black church watching this separation. They're watching the parts of the white church kind of split in two. And this isn't something that they just kind of caught them by surprise. They're looking and say, okay, what's going on here? And you'll see in these publications them saying, hey, we don't actually need to choose one of these two. One of the main points I say is unique about the Black church, the tradition, is that it didn't fit in the progressive or conservative. They look at this and they say, well, we can't go to the right with those folks because we'll lose our bodies, because there's no justice there. There's a problem. They also say, and this is not talked about as much, we also cannot go to the left because they're pushing away the authority of Scripture and we'll lose our souls. There is a major part of this. There is a deliberate decision to say, this is what we're doing is something different. Now, obviously, the Black church isn't a monolith, but if you read people like Dr. Esau McCaulley, which talks about the primary stream of the Black ecclesial tradition, that was the decision being made, and you see it throughout a lot of Black denominations at that time. They're watching this and making that deliberate choice.
So essentially, you're arguing that this whole war, culture war, has been a fight essentially inside white America, and Black Christians are often drafted into it, but they don't actually fit the categories. Like, can you unpack that maybe even a little bit
general,
more? Like
the tradition doesn't fit the categories.
Gotcha.
Black people are not the principles. That doesn't mean that some haven't chosen to go on. They just want the principles of it.
So how did the two sides pressure the Black church, or have pressured the Black church, to either compromise or lose its distinct voice? I'd love for you to kind of help our audience understand that.
I don't know that it's one thing. I think a lot of times, whether it be white evangelicals or even folks on the left, it's a resource issue. And so for a lot of, let's say I want to run for office and I live in Atlanta, Georgia, which I do, a lot of those resources are coming from secular progressive spaces, which I think eventually push you into a more leftward stance on issues. And you can see that in prayers out to Reverend Jesse Jackson, but when he runs for president, he had been very clearly pro-life. He runs for president, and that changes. And so I think as you go through the years, the resources, the exposure, all play into, at least for the leadership class, them kind of moving over, usually for, further left than I think the people in the pews were.
When we had Jamar Tisby on our show, I remember him saying, and I'm probably paraphrasing here, but the Black church exists because the white church basically exists. Basically, the Black church exists because Blacks weren't allowed to fellowship with white congregants. But Black people have always been people of faith for a long, long time, especially in the American context. So do you think that their influence on the culture changed or shifted once they could actually start meeting inside buildings, or has there been kind of an active movement, from Black people of faith to still influence like the culture?
I think there's I think that, so I want to separate the culture in general from the culture war, right? I think the Black church, Black culture in general has had an impact on American culture. Even when you go from, you talk about the invisible institutions where they're meeting, they got to hide because this is one of the first religious liberty issues, right? They're not allowed to praise and preach and have church in the same way. Later on, something else you mentioned is, Absalom Jones and how they got kicked out of the church and they had to create the African Methodist Church. These things have major impacts, and they do start to form how the Black church sees kind of the white church, whether that be the white evangelical church or the mainline church, and has impacts on it. But I think what Tisby says is correct, because the white church was not trying to integrate. That's where you create the Black church, and I get some people, I guess, have an issue with the idea of the Black church. I think that's hard to maintain and have an understanding of history to put it in the historical context. And I would expect those same people to have a problem with the Dutch Reformed Church. I don't think people have a problem with that distinction, but you see that work the other way sometimes too.
Yeah, you absolutely do. And the labels that we use, I mean, it's like, it's the curse of being human, like wanting to categorize things. And yet when you categorize things, you almost like put them into this box that you really struggle to let them out of, at least conceptually within your mind. And one of the things that you do is you talk about the kind of values that are presented by the culture war, and then how a orthodox and a strongly biblical understanding can replace this. And one of the things I saw was so good was the Imago Dei and the concept of original sin as a replacement for the good guys versus the bad guys kind of ideology. Could you go into more depth on that? Help us understand what you mean by that.
So one feature of the culture war is the idea that this is clearly a battle of good versus evil. And while I agree that on one issue to another, one side may clearly be better than the other on the issue. One side may actually seem very wicked on the issue. However, in the whole, this is not simply a battle of good versus evil. It's not that simple. And when we make it a battle of good versus evil, one thing that we do is we stop examining our side and we let our side get away with a lot because we've got to prove that we're actually good. So we can't admit that we do anything wrong because that would kind of mess us up in the eyes or on the scoreboard. The other thing we do is we're unwilling to admit when the other side gets something right. And we're unwilling to admit that they're redeemable and that they might actually have a contribution to make to society. That is something that the civil rights tradition did not do. This Black church civic engagement didn't do. They were able to, if you look even through some of their disciplines that they upheld, they were very clear on that they were sinful too. I mean, even if you listen to, something like the Black National Anthem, right? It's the end of it is asking God to, and this was influenced by Christian, this had a very Christian influence, asking God to save them from themselves, not to leave them to their own devices because they knew they could go corrupt too. That is not what you see in the culture war. And so what I tell people to do is you want to replace that good versus evil with a Imago Dei original sin framework. The Imago Dei side of it says that me and my enemy are made in the image of God. Therefore, we have dignity and we are redeemable. That's one of the big differences, I think, between, because I give a pretty sharp critique of conservatism and progressivism, but I also give a sharp critique of what I see as kind of Black secular activism and the differences there, which is the idea that no, these people are redeemable. And I have to believe that, and I have to be holy, and I have to have a redemptive point of view as I engage people. Very different. So that's what the Imago Dei does. And the original sin says, I too am broken. And unless I want to end up like the praying Pharisee in Luke or go about this like Jonah as he looked at Nineveh, then I really need to consider how I want to persuade people towards redemption rather than just condemning them. That's a different perspective. That's exactly what Shirley Chisholm was doing, right, when she engages George Wallace. We don't do that because we don't think we need to. We don't think that other people on the other side have anything to contribute. I'll say this last part. it's just very important for us to engage with that viewpoint. Otherwise, we miss a lot that we can get from others and dismiss some of the bad things that we can do to ourselves and others.
I really love that, and it made me think about one particular topic that we address occasionally on this show. I mean, that's the topic of deconstruction. And so deconstruction, for those that aren't tracking, it's like you've reached a point in your life where you no longer think you believe in God, or at least your relationship with God is strained in a way. And this is probably a terrible characterization of what it really is. But in essence, like when I see or read about people deconstructing or whatnot, it always seems like it's a white person. And again, broad categorization. I don't have the stats or anything like that, but just anecdotally, like it just appears that way. I read a article a couple months ago that was sort of trying to explain that phenomenon, how people that are deconstructing typically tend to be white. And the article essentially landed on, Black people don't deconstruct as much because when they have tension with their faith, they don't run away from it. They press into it. And white people just don't do that. Or at least I shouldn't say like all white people, but the majority of the white people that they were referring to in the article. And I'd love for you just to kind of maybe talk on that just a little bit, if there's any truth to that, or, is there a phenomenon here that people of color seem to be immune from?
Yeah, I don't know if I go so far as to say immune. I do know just by the statistics that African Americans are just very religious people, and we lean into that religion. You don't find as many Black atheists as you might in other communities, although they exist. And I know Black people who would say they deconstructed, whatever you want to call it, walked away from the faith. That does happen. I do think it's part of, if there's a difference, part of that difference is probably at least partially due to that rich heritage of saying just because things are bad doesn't mean God abandoned me. Or even being able to look at the American church and say, just because the American church got Christianity wrong doesn't mean I'm going to walk away from Christianity, right? Like if I have a friend who fails their physics test, I don't say that physics doesn't work. I say they failed the test. And so I think it's a different perspective that most likely comes from that rich tradition.
I think that's a brilliant analogy, by the way. I absolutely love that about the physics test. It's like if someone doesn't do this right, then completely throwing out the entire, organization and system, it just doesn't make sense even logically. And, you point out you have mentioned that you do a critique of both sides of this culture war. And as a conservative, I would love to bring out, you argue that the conservative church historically has justified slavery, which is true, Jim Crow, ongoing systemic racism. And this isn't just bad history when people deny this and downplay this, right? It's actually breaking the 10 Commandments, like bearing false witness. What can you go deeper into that? Is this still happening? Are you still seeing this? What is the critique that you're bringing even today? Because essentially, it's like the white church has gotten race really wrong, and that's kind of the big issue that I'm getting from your work. I'd love for you to help us understand that more.
Yeah, the fundamental problem that I see with a lot of the ideological conservatism followed by many white evangelicals is very simply a lack of compassion. Any ideology has flaws because anything touched by human hands is going to have flaws. It's so important for Christians to identify those flaws. Even if you lean left or right, you need to identify those flaws. Any ideology that has a group of Christians getting slavery wrong, then getting Jim Crow wrong, then getting continually getting these same things wrong, there's a flaw there. And the problem that I have with many ideologically conservative Christians is when you have a flaw that's caused you to miss something that big, you need to find the fix. You need to put guardrails in place that make sure you never do that again.
Yeah, that's good.
anytime something that bad happens, that's what you're supposed to do. And the sad part is, I think because of pride, that has not been done. And so I fear that the next time something like that comes up, you're going to miss again because you're too prideful to say, where did we get this wrong? Why did we get this wrong? Please, I need to identify the issue so we can move forward in a better way. My critique of progressivism comes down to a lack of moral knowledge and an inability to deal with some facts of life. The core of progressivism really says that truth comes from the individual. And so if there's a standard, if there's something in the Bible that goes against what the individual is feeling or wants to be true or their self-perception, it's the standard that's wrong. It's the Bible that's wrong and not the person that needs to be transformed. And I think we've seen, even in this, last election cycle and just on, that puts progressives into some pretty absurd positions. And that's what I find to be their main issue. And that's, instead of being able to say, no, sin exists and we can be deceived by our own self-perception, they want to push away the truth in general. And again, that's tough. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that, progressives tend to push away the idea of absolute truth and the idea of sin. But the truth of the matter is you can't have justice without absolute truth. Right? If I say, hey, Josh, you need to do justice, that means I'm giving you an unconditional standard. And whether Josh understands that standard, whether he agrees with that standard or not, he's still got to do it. That's absolute truth. So you can't say there's absolute truth when you want to push somebody to do justice who doesn't agree with you, but then there's not absolute truth when it comes to something you want to do that God says you shouldn't do. That's the dilemma that I see with a lot of progressivism. And so for those two critiques, that's the basis of them. And obviously in the book, I dig a lot deeper.
Do you see any shifts in Black church theology over, whatever time period in the same way that, you can see changes in theology from traditionally white churches, specifically on things like abortion or same-sex marriage or, name slavery, name the issue. It seems like that there is sort of this line, this through line of theology that seems to ebb and flow depending on what the current political, issue is of the day. So
Sure.
do you see the same thing in Black churches?
Oh yeah. I think there's a big debate kind of tension right now. And I think Trump has something to do with it as a lot of African Americans look at the white evangelical church. They want to move away as far as possible as they, to distinguish themselves and understand that. But the question I think people have to ask is, do we move the parts of our tradition that came right just to be a reaction, just as a reaction to Trump? Do we go the same way as the kind of white mainline church? I think that's proven to be a failure. Whatever we do, I would make sure that we hold on to the authority of Scripture, because I think anything that moves away from that is not right. If you would have talked to Fannie Lou Hamer, if you would have talked to Fred Shuttlesworth and many of the people who were a part of that movement, they would have said, absolutely, don't do that. When we saw the culture that happened in the culture world, we said no, and you need to say no now. So yeah, that's a major conversation. I don't know, where it goes, but I think we need to stick with the mainstream of that Black ecclesial tradition.
I mean, I got to say, I have a lot of conviction reviewing your book and hearing you talk about it, because I agree so much with what you're saying. And I am coming to the place where I am seriously rejecting the categories of conservative and liberal as applied to me in any way. And I think one of the things is you talk about issue by issue, at least heavily implied, this idea of issue by issue, working through it, almost like rejecting this idea, because you think one thing, now this whole constellation and group of beliefs now are implicitly put on you. and which you didn't choose, you didn't think through, and you haven't made a final decision on, and yet one thing categorizes you with all of that. I have questions about specific issues, but if you have anything you want to say in response to that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I spent some time on this, and obviously it's more in depth in the book. One of the primary criticisms, I guess, of me and probably the AIM campaign, probably by some of your former guests, is that we don't choose a side. And I think what people are getting at there is don't just stand on the fence. Don't just be in that mushy middle where you're not taking a position that's not doing anybody good. And I actually agree with that. I would say that there's nothing inherently virtuous about being in the middle, especially if you're doing it to avoid conflict or avoid friction. If that's the path of least resistance, there's nothing virtuous about it. But I would say this. When you choose a side, you basically end up outsourcing your public witness to one side or the other. Because let's say that I choose the progressive side because they get 6 out of 10 issues right. What do I do with those other 4 issues they get wrong? Yes. What do I do when I have a conviction that they don't like and they tell me to censor it or just disavow it publicly? Do I do that because I wanted to choose a side? Or is the better option to say, I'm going to choose the right position on every issue? So I'm not going to choose, hey, you guys are better one. I'm going to give my public witness that you do what you want. No, I'm going to look at the issues based on my values. And issue by issue, I'm going to say, here's where I stand. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't join a party or find alliance with one side or the other. But it does mean that I actually can lead sometimes because I haven't just given everything that I have to one side and just refuse to. And that's the other thing. If they get 6 out of the 10 things right, on those other 4, what am I going to do? Just shut up and not tell them that it's wrong?
Right.
Because I want those other 4. And so that's why I think I get what people are saying when they say, just choose a side. I don't think they've thought that all the way through. And I think that's exactly what the parties want you to do. If all I have to do is say I'm better on one other issue and they'll just miss everything on this, oh yeah, of course. Of course they would want you to do that. I think that's a recipe to maintain the status quo.
I absolutely agree. And I think it also, on top of that, sparks and fuels, not only sparks, but fuels division and that me versus you mentality that is so pervasive right now. I want to think about Christian nationalism for a second, because arguably, and honestly, what I think is it's been around since the beginning of this country, no doubt about it. But it has a certain iteration. So I'm thinking about the certain iteration right now of Christian nationalism. It's having a moment. There's a certain kind of almost reform / Pentecostal kind of weird, like Christian nationalist, like movement that's happening. We've talked in depth with a lot of people on this. It's very real. How would you explain to someone who's listening to this and they're like, look, I get it. Like, I get that we should be on both sides. I'm just thinking about conservative right now, but they're like, dude, you can't tell me the Democratic Party is not anti-Christian or, just think about the issues. They're literally like okay with killing kids, babies. They're literally okay with, redefining marriage completely. They want to bring drag queens and have them, read stories to my children. And I'm not trying to be crass here. These are real things I've heard people say, and it's how people are thinking, especially white people that I know. And so the question is, and I think Christian nationalism right now is a predominantly white thing. Why is this a bad strategy, Justin? Why is this an issue? Help us understand within your framing, your understanding, what is wrong with Christian nationalism? And how is it kind of a betrayal of the Black church story that you have been telling and you're telling in this book?
Yeah, one thing about it is that it works off the assumption that America is a Christian nation. And I would raise questions there. Christian influence to some extent, sure. Theist influence as well. But if we look at the actions and how America has treated people, for instance, my people have been denied the right to vote far longer than we've had it. We can go over and over how injustice was actually written into the justice system. That doesn't seem all that Christian to me. So I think it's really ahistorical. But what's worse is it's asking people. So basically, it's also undemocratic, right? Because it's saying that's not the deal we made with people when they came here. We didn't say you're going to have some advantage or the laws are going to reflect you more just because you're Christian. It's a lack of integrity, because that's not the deal that we make with people when they come here. My atheist brothers and sisters, I may disagree with them. They have just as much of a right to bring their argument into the public square. And if they win the day, they win the day. But what's interesting to me is we've just talked about the history of conservatism and all that. And a lot of conservatives are in that Christian nationalist movement. But based on that history, you're asking people to trust you to come up with the laws and to be fair and all that when you've never proven that you can do it. And I would say this too, what you call Christianity, a lot of Christians like myself wouldn't even recognize it. So this isn't about the thing. The thing about this is it's not about Christianity. It's about conservative ideology. And it's also, a lot of it is kind of some type of identity politics on the right, which just doesn't serve anybody well. And there's nothing within the history of this country to say that they would be fair, and if they were able to wield that much power and everybody just had to go along with it. It's not about Christianity. It's about power. It's about domination. And I would want nothing to do with it, even as a Christian, even as somebody who would agree with some of the things you said earlier. I think it's a travesty the way that the left has handled abortion, some of the things that they're trying to put in elementary school curriculums. I think it's wicked. Those aren't the only issues, though. And so I have to be able to soberly look at all the issues to see where I stand. And that's the reason why I would never just completely stand with the left. I would never just completely stand with the right. As an Orthodox Black man, I have issues with both, and I'm not going to be silent about those issues to make somebody feel better.
Where do you think that the Black church really is the most effective when trying to fight the culture war? And then what are some areas that, there's some work to be done?
So let me say this too, that the book isn't just kind of like an exaltation of the Black church. It challenges the Black church too, especially today's Black church. So I think there's some ways that my tradition and the tradition I'm still in fall short of the legacy that it's been given. And so I'm very clear on where I see issues there. One of the biggest, and I'm trying to find something I haven't already talked about, one of the biggest things that it brings to bear is the need for self-examination. And it's the need to address issues with tenacity, but also grace. Okay. One of the things that some of the groups in the civil rights movement used to do before they actually engaged is they went through this process. And part of the process was called self-purification. It was to make sure that before you engaged, that you could do so constructively, that you could do so without bitterness and without being vengeful. So they would pray, come together, have conversations to make sure that they were in the mindset and that their spirits were right to engage in a constructive way, or else you needed to kind of back up and figure it out. That's something imagine if all the Christians imagine if before they tweeted something out, before they shared something on social media, they went through that process of self-purification, before they attacked somebody. They looked at it as if I'm an ambassador of Christ, as if he was making his appeal through me. Would we say the same things that we said? That's what they were doing.
Man. I have a suggestion, and you can steal this if you want. A Christian CAPTCHA. I mean, hear me out. The little figures, is it a sidewalk?
Are you a Christian? Next to, are you a robot? Are you a Christian robot, dude? Now that's the real question. That's really good, man. I really appreciate this conversation. This is my last question, and then Will has one more question for you. But I want to think about for a few minutes cancel culture. One of the things you bring out is that both sides essentially will cancel you. They've already kind of proved that. I do think, by the way, identity politics is alive and well on both sides. It's as much a right issue as it is a left. It's very much in there. When we're thinking about free speech, how does the fruit of the Spirit, you talk about this, and even the idea of the moral imagination, how does it change the way that people deal with and talk about what they believe, and then even how they treat what other people say?
Yeah, no, it's a
And work
great
through that.
question. I think because of what we know of how the story ends, of the promises of God, Christians should always be able to avoid being arrested by the situation and the circumstances. So I understand the circumstances. I take the circumstances seriously, but my reaction is going to be dictated more by my values and who Jesus was than dictated by the circumstances. So the way that I talk to somebody is, even somebody who hates me, is the ability not just to see hear the words coming out of their mouth, but to have the moral imagination to see human dignity behind their hatred.
Hmm.
When I'm captured by the moment, when I'm so caught up in the moment and what they said to me and this rivalry and the back and forth, I can't see people for who they are and past what they're saying
Hmm.
at that moment.
Hmm.
That's never okay for a Christian. And the
Come
culture
on, dude.
war and what I've been calling conflict entrepreneurs who have made an industry out of division, they push us and push us and push us. And eventually, if we don't have that moral imagination, we will hate our enemy, because our algorithms are feeding us every reason to do that. Every negative thing that they do, we're going to see. Any bad thing we do, we're going to make an excuse for it. Eventually, yes, you will hate your neighbor. You will hate your enemy if that's the case. A Christian can never allow themselves to get that caught up. And a Christian should be able to step back, identify these conflict entrepreneurs, and say, no, I'm not going along with it. But unfortunately, I think too many Christians today in the culture war are being discipled by the
Yeah, which is a good reminder for parents out there that you should erase your kids' YouTube history, especially if your kids are on YouTube, because you can go down a pretty crazy cycle. That wasn't my question, but it was just more of a life lesson. But my last question for you though is, we've been talking about a lot of the sort of like darkness that exists in the world, and you're a person that has studied this in depth, and you must have like a horrendous sleep schedule, because if I were studying this stuff nonstop, I'd never be able to sleep. But I love just for you to end us on a high note. Like, what are some things that actually give you hope when you wake up every morning, you look at the world the way it is? Like, what's something that keeps you going?
Well, I think for me, just going to church and seeing Christians still come together, and the value that us fellowshipping has, and how it can, when we're all in our rooms watching cable news, we may feel one way. But if you got good leadership, a good shepherd, and church, it can bring us out of that. It can tell us actually there is something better, and bring out that deep, that deep joy that we all should have. So that for me, that's a weekly encouragement, whether it's just that from my Bible study class. I mean, these are people that I just lean on and really appreciate. But also, as we've traveled, to see Christians, white Christians, black Christians. Well, let me back up a little bit. One of the things I think is unique about our organization, especially because we deal with politics and culture, is we've been able to build up the trust to go into primarily black churches with our framework, and primarily white conservative churches with our framework. That's rare, to be able to
Yes.
bring the same framework with people who may disagree on who they voted for, and find appreciation there. So as I go to those two and with the same framework, to see people having appreciation because we're trying our best to be impartial and to be faithful to Scripture, that tells me that all is not lost, and that God is working even as we speak.
I really, really love that. Thank you so much, Justin, for coming on. How can people get in contact with you, follow the AND campaign? Yeah, do your your sale right now of yourself and what you guys are doing.
Yeah. Again, if you want to know how I believe the civil rights generation would react to today's polarization, you got to go get Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around. So that's the book that just came out. You can follow me on the AND campaign on Instagram, which is at AND campaign, or Justin E. Giboney on Twitter. And you can also listen to the Church Politics Podcast, which comes out every week, where I provide local commentary from the biblical point of view.
Well, thank you again. It was such a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, brother. I enjoyed this conversation.
Same. And to our viewers and listeners, guys, thanks for joining. Share this with someone who needs to hear this. We desperately need this kind of material out there. So share this. And until next time, guys, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless.